All right, everybody, so today I just finished up the chapter on quickness and got pretty heavy into the chapter called exactitude. And I'm going to do exactly what I did the other day by recanting the points of reference that I thought were notable and helped to guide the reader towards a book of this book within this book. The idea that somebody can see that while you're reading this book, it's trying to actually operate on itself at the same time. There are things that you come to and conclusions that you can see and review which reveal themselves as you apply the dynamics that are talked about within. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on this. And one of the first places that I stopped today in my reading, let's get to it. Did you guys see anything? Was anything revealed? Did you for a moment gaze upon the clouds? My little umbrella does wonders for keeping the heat at bay, but then we're catching the wind. So, here we are. Ending on quickness. He's talking about time here and quickness, and then he's going to relate this to an exactitude, and he comes to this conclusion about himself where he's sort of trying to read himself and understand maybe why he expresses himself in certain ways, or even why we are what we are, which would give insight as to how everything expresses itself. For we could not be without the other. And he comes to a statement such as this. And this is actually in Lawrence Stern's piece of poetry here, which I enjoy this book because he writes very like flowery, but comes to points at the same point in time. And it has a whole host of all these short works and stories throughout the thing, which are always great to listen to. But he says, This writer, he's translating this from another language, and it says, any means, any weapon can be used to save oneself from death and time. If a straight line is the shortest distance between two fatal and inescapable points, then digressions lengthen that line. And if these digressions become so complex, tangled, tortuous, and so rapid as to obscure their own tracks, then perhaps death won't find us again. Perhaps time will lose its way. Perhaps we'll be able to remain concealed in our ever-changing hiding places. And he's all working this together because, again, he's showing how opposite things work in sort of harmony with each other and things to that extent. So, then he's saying, well, I might say I prefer to entrust myself to the straight line in the hopes that it will continue on into infinity and make me unreachable. Because pretty soon we're going to get to this place where we're talking about exactness, but the more that we know exactness, are we not just, again, coming to a place where we realize the end? The more that we are this thing, do we then end ourselves in a way? And is not life itself built upon this premise that here we'll get to a place where he describes language, and it's going to relate to what I'm saying right here. Natural languages always say something more than formalized languages. They always carry a certain amount of noise that alters the essence of information, which means you can be looking at one thing, but something else is there at the exact same time, which you could speak about. And he again speaks upon this notion in his statement. And also because I created a multifaceted structure in which each brief text sits close to others in a sequence that doesn't suggest causality or hierarchy, but rather a network within which one can follow multiple paths and come to various ramified conclusions. So, he's going to connect all this stuff, just as we're talking about these digressions. Can hide our tracks and obscure things into infinity. Then we're going to use this idea to create definition, which then leads us into those parallels of natural language, which always creates an artifact of there being something else there as well. And he states, I would like to put together a collection of stories consisting of a single sentence, or if possible, a single line. And I say that part is important because then this whole next chapter is on exactitude, but during the entire chapter, he kind of doesn't necessarily speak in definitive terms. He always describes that you look at the leaf long enough and then there will be a bud kind of thing if you describe the leaf enough. And so he relates these macrocosmic to microcosmic things. But then I think that he states something very noteworthy upcoming. He says, for this reason, the proper use of language to me is one that helps us approach things, present or absent, with discretion, attention, and caution, and with respect for what these things, present or absent, can tell us without words. Because right before this, he states a quote by Wittgenstein, and it's was verborgen ist, interessiert uns nicht. It says, what is hidden is of no interest to us. But again, he's then saying right after for this reason of proper use of language to me, we have to approach things with discretion, attention, and caution. So to actually write about exactness, it's like me saying again, like if I want things to be concise, and he, states some other kind of like things to the extent of what he feels is appealing to him, is the succession of whole numbers, the straight lines of Euclid, rather than telling you how I've written what I've written. Perhaps it would be more interesting to tell you about what problems I have yet to resolve and don't know how to resolve them. But anyways, language is a thing that does take this sort of tact to be able to state things in a way which allows you to, as he would then say, which is very important. We're going to relate some some mathematics here. If I can find it. Musil comes closest to proposing a solution when, in chapter 83, he recalls the existence of mathematical problems that did not admit of any general solution, though they did admit of particular solutions, the combining of which brought one nearer to the general solution. So again, speaking on is ignorance bliss, we can come to these points, but we have to do these things in a manner which relates all these things in sort of an order which allows it to be everything at once at the same point in time. So then language can connect and flow to all points in time, and there's always something there else as well. So we're relating some mathematics here with these ideas in his treatise on exactitude. He did come to a point in time where he does, make mention of something that is completely done away with the idea of there being something more. But he tries to use tact as much as he can to get to that point. And just a few more things. He talks about Mercury and Vulcan. Mercury and Vulcan represent two inseparable and complementary functions of life. Mercury represents syntony or harmonious participation in the world around us. Vulcan represents focalization or constructive concentration. So a writer's labor involves keeping track of different times, Mercury's time and Vulcan's time. And he gives us a Chinese story as well to kind of maybe give some contrast here. But again, a lot of this stuff makes sense after almost. But he's using these ideas that he's proposed about, the king falls ill. But why? What kind of sickness does the king tell? Well, Galileo says that, the richness and the coarseness of language is actually more the truth than kind of these other things. And he's going back and forth between this stuff all the time. And so he says, among Zhang Zhao's many virtues was his talent for drawing. The king asked him to draw a crab. Zhang Zhao said he would need 5 years in a villa with 12 servants. After 5 years, he had not yet begun the drawing. I need another 5 years, he said. The king agreed. When the 10th year was up, Zhang Zhao took his brush and in an instant, with a single flourish, drew a crab, the most perfect crab anyone had ever seen. And in a way, a lot of Italian stuff is always focused on this idea of squaring the circle. He's giving us just enough reason to kind of go along, but then it reveals something there at the end which makes us feel like he left something out on purpose. And now whether that's the case is all a matter of coming into something from perception. Maybe it's natural, maybe it's not at the same point in time. Again, this whole idea of comparing and contrasting things and saying that, well, anything that exists is more similar than non-existence itself at all anyways. And so coming to a similarity between things that which would otherwise be compared as opposites is as fluid and harmonious as we can get to understanding the truth, perhaps. So he kind of defends himself a little bit here. He says the egg of Columbus that enabled him to overcome the writer's block, which, until he was nearly 40, kept him from moving from essayistic prose to narrative prose. Borg's idea was to pretend that the book he wanted to write had already been written, and then to describe, summarize, and review that imaginary book. Kind of interesting, I thought. And then he talks about how the perceptions of life and some things by some people talking about, he's trying to actually build up his position by utilizing narratives from another side, which say that poetry is more magnificent the more vague it is, and in Italian vago is actually like a word that denotes this beauty, this air to it. And hence a sky scattered with little clouds is perhaps more pleasurable than a totally clear sky, and a view of the sky is perhaps less pleasurable than one of the land, the countryside, etc., because less various and also less like us, less suited to us, less related to what is ours. And so he begins, talking more about this exactitude and all these things, and says that maybe he is a Saturnian man, reaching for mercurial like existences, and Saturnian is more this sort of internalized, cold suited being, and Mercury flies on wings and is this idea that everything kind of coexists. And he notes that maybe the exactitude, maybe we're afraid of existence. Something, a lot of this stuff I feel very connected to what he's saying. For some reason my mind actually thinks the way in which he's writing. It's very interesting. He says it's nothing much. He said it's a tenth of a second appearing. Wait, at certain moments my body lights up. This is very odd. Suddenly I can see into myself. I can make out the depths of the layers of my flesh. I feel zones of pain, rings, pulls, plumes of pain. Do you see these living forms, this geometry of my suffering? There are certain flashes that are exactly like ideas. They make me understand. From here to there, yet they leave me uncertain. So, talks about this and gives some other examples. He says Valery, who best defined poetry as a striving toward exactitude, but at that same point in time, he's paralleling exactitude with this infiniteness, right? And saying which is more appealing in general kind of thing, and he's trying to defend his what he views himself as here, and what he thinks should be included in obviously the ultimate direction of his book, Mementos, these mementos for the next millennia, what he thinks should survive in language. There's another good quote in here. He talks about how you can always redirect focus. The definitive conquest of which the empire's multifarious treasures were but illusory husks came down to a tile of plain wood. The tile on which your enlightened gaze is fixed was cut from a cross-section of a trunk that grew in a year of drought. And then he talks about the limits of language itself. Language is exposed as a lacunous fragmentary. It always says something less than the sum of what can be experienced. And maybe that's, again, his infatuation with it, right? He talks about William Carlos Williams, who describes a cyclamen leaf in such minute detail that he causes the flower to take shape and bloom from the leaf he has described, and so succeeds in giving to the poem the lightness of the plant. So anyways, I think that's kind of it. He talks about, the qualities I have chosen as subjects for these, that's what I already said, but he says the Latin maxim, festina lente, make haste slowly. he's very infatuated and bound to these ideas of these bipolar instances. But if you get into a place that's so deep as to imagine and ponder existence and non-existence itself, everything in existence is so similar, and creates a multifaceted image in which these things are creating points throughout the entire network and structure of this book. So this was one thing that I'm kind of hung up on right now, just a little bit. No, I'm not, because he's just comparing himself with somebody else's viewpoint. And again, the book is very readable. It's light, it's airy, like a book should be, like something feels when you're actually enjoying being able to follow some tale, and it's not, overburdened with some sort of following or adherence to something. It forgets and leaves things just as much as it comes into view of something new. So again, this is Six Memos for the Next Millennium by Italo Calvino. I'll see you guys next time.